Hi, Jeff Finkelstein from Customer Paradigm in beautiful Boulder, Colorado. This is a photo I took a couple of miles away from our office. Today, Mike Stacey is going to run through PWA for Magento and why this technology is going to change the face of web design in the next few years. PWA stands for Progressive Web Applications and gives you the ability to create incredibly fast, app-like sites. In my opinion, PWA is where responsive web design was 5 years ago. And now, responsive web design is the industry standard. So I'll turn it over to Mike, who prepared this presentation for a Colorado meetup last week. But because the meetup was in a loud coffee shop, we've re-recorded it here in our studio in Boulder, Colorado, in front of a live audience of Magento developers. We've included a couple of live demos at the end. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm going to do a presentation on progressive web apps. Progressive web apps is what the PWA acronym stands for. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, what is a PWA? Well, PWA is an acronym that will add $8,000 to your annual salary. What it actually is, so a progressive web app is a native functionality that exists in a browser as it is today, but gives app-like performance to a website. The concept kind of arose where people were having a split between what website they were being built for them and the applications that run natively on a mobile device. So what happens when a large company has a website, they will typically make an app to go along with that website that allows additional functionality for a phone user. That's a costly experience. It's something that you have to develop independently for each independent device that is out there. So you have to do an Android app, you have to do an iOS app. The concept of a progressive web app is to say, let's remove all of that difference between these two different platforms and say that the website itself is going to function very similar to the way in which an app does. So when a person is navigating your website on a mobile device and they lose connection to the internet, what typically happens on that website now is that it shuts down. Safari or whatever app you're using to browse the internet just stops working. It stops using any kind of interactivity. What a progressive web app does is it utilizes web technology that currently exists right now within the browser to continue that experience so that when you have interruptions within service, you don't lose the functionality. And it also has a performance side to it where the application itself is fast, it's responsive, and it feels like native technology. It doesn't have the lag of a constant HTTPS reload. It feels like it's happening in real time as you're interacting with it. So by utilizing web technologies that currently exist in the browser now, you can give users that kind of an experience. So where does it come from? Like all things, it comes from Google. Back in 2015, there were developers who were working on the Chrome browser who coined the term PWA, but what they were doing is trying to utilize what currently exists within a browser now to be able to get those functionalities. So instead of installing additional plugins or having additional applications installed on your phone, you can open up your browser and with the existing technology as it exists, be able to utilize these kind of functionalities. And I'll break down that a little bit further, but the philosophical concept is that this is completely non-obtrusive. As a user of a web application, you would never know the difference between that. You're not installing anything new, you're not utilizing any new technology, nor as web developers are we having to learn any new technology or integrate anything new into the site outside of what the tech stack as it exists right now. So the philosophy behind that kind of breaks down into some bullet points that somebody was paid way too much money to come up with. So I'm just going to run down these real quick. These are the kind of things that you're forced to memorize if you were taking a quiz, but are actually irrelevant from day-to-day usage. But the big touch points are it's progressive, and that phrase can be somewhat confusing given the context. But what it means here is that the application itself will work for every user on every browser, on every device. It is completely agnostic to the technology stack that the user is interacting with. If you have a smartphone and that smartphone can get onto the internet, your application is going to work on that smartphone. It is not specific to any kind of particular browser. It is agnostic to that now. Responsive just means that it's going to work and look on every single device the same. As in, if you go onto mobile and you want to click a button, that button needs to work. That button needs to be clickable by anybody who has, a typical 10-digit kind of situation that they're working with. So lemurs should be able to use this. The three-toed sloth, out of luck. Connectivity independent. This relates back to service workers, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But the reality is that connectivity to the internet is what we expect the internet to have to be able to access it. What this idea is going to do is going to push forward local storage on the device itself to be able to cache the content of a website so that even if you're not connected to the internet, interactivity between the application can still exist. And that's sort of the revolutionary concept within PWAs, because it allows caching to be able to store interactivity and then allow the user to continue to access, use the site, read articles, add things to the shopping cart, and then once connectivity is reestablished, it proceeds with the requests to be able to send that content to the actual server and get back the information that you need. So while you wouldn't be able to fully check out using a non-connected PWA, you would still be able to add everything to your cart and have it stored there until you get back into the internet. So app-like is what we already covered. It just needs to feel like a native app. It isn't a native app, but it has the feeling so that the user doesn't really make a distinction between the two. Fresh, which is absurd. I mean, somebody thought they were so goddamn cool when they figured out that they could say, it's going to be fresh. And what that means is that it stays up to date. What they're really trying to say is that the service workers can continually fetch and retrieve data that loads in the background so that you as a user are constantly getting new information despite the fact that you may not even be requesting that information. It loads in the background. There is a big emphasis on HTTPS from Google, so safety is what they are going to insist on. Discoverable means that there's a W3C standard for everything that you put onto this website. So it means that some of the problems that we have with front-end JavaScript libraries not being indexable or searchable by Google means that that is no longer acceptable within the PWA world. It has to be able to be crawled, it has to be able to be accessed, and it can't be hidden behind any kind of application code that hides the content from being able to be discovered. And then the rest of these, linkable and installable, I mean, these are just phrases that no one really cares about. So what does this matter to Magento? What is it about Magento that makes the move towards incorporating PWA technology into the core so important? Well, I mean, it's one word, it's Luma. If you have any experience with the Magento front end, you understand that it is complicated and it is slow. And with caching and server configurations, you can speed up that process. You can make that a usable experience, but there's nobody who looks to Magento 2 and says that's the most performant application I've ever used in my life. Nobody. And from a developer perspective, it's even slower because we can't use caching from a development perspective to be able to spin up and preview our content. There are layers upon layers upon layers of sophisticated technology that you have to utilize to be able to get Magento 2's front end to be able to be usable. What PWA Studio looks to do is to completely to detach that front end so that you can use a modern tech stack to be able to develop a front end that is fast and interactive and some of the fastest applications you will find on the internet. The reason why they chose to be as aggressive as they are, because the PWA project is a slow-moving project in that it's been around since 2015, but it isn't integrated into a lot of systems. It's a relatively new idea. The reason they're so aggressive is that the response from the community about the Magento front end is that it was challenging to work with, and it wasn't very performant. And once your store gets more sophisticated and more complicated, it adds even more performance lag to it. So there was a need in the Magento world to rethink the front end. And when they hired on a new team of front end developers after Magento 2 got released, the push to incorporate PWA into the system evolved into what Magento is calling the PWA Studio. And that studio is going to be a tool set for you to be able to take Magento, rip off the front end, and build whatever front end on top of it that you want to use. So what it looks like right now is this. So the PWA Studio has a theme that's going to be native inside the Magento core called Venya, and it's going to be a one-to-one replacement for something like Blank or Luma. Blank and Luma, when you get into the admin, you'll be able to select between them, and you'll be able to select whatever theme that you want. So the concept in Magento of the theme is still going to be consistent. It's still going to be the same systems that we're used to using, only instead of being driven by PHP, PHTMLs, Knockout.js, less, and CSS files, it's actually going to be driven by whatever tech stack you plug and play with. Currently, the PWA Studio has its own tech stack, but even that, the core of the PWA Studio is not going to be the stack that the team that's working on it right now chooses. The Studio is sort of like a plug and play operation so that you can grab whatever tech stack you want to use, plug it in, and it's going to work with Magento. So as it exists right now, the PWA Studio components are React.js for doing all of your front-end application code. Webpack is going to be driving all of the interconnectivity between all the other modules that are going to be involved. So Webpack is going to provide a module to interact with the service workers, with Babel, or with whatever systems that you want. So Webpack is going to be a core kind of router, for lack of a better term, for taking all of the applications that you want to be working with, put them into one place, have one configuration file, launch that file, and that's going to create all your dependencies for you. And then the last thing is GraphQL. Now GraphQL is going to be incorporated in Magento 2.3 in and of itself as a separate different system. So while it's going to work together with the PWA Studio to be able to improve performance, GraphQL is going to be its own entity. So, real quick, what is GraphQL? So that's the real big thing. So React and Webpack, these are interchangeable. If you want to use Vue.js, if you want to use AngularJS, you can do any of those things. But with GraphQL, that's kind of really the real important thing to focus on for the PWA Studio and how it connects to Magento. So GraphQL was a technology that was conceived in Facebook, and it was a way of getting past REST API calls. So Magento's headless system relies upon an API call that allows you to basically query off of the database without actually writing any PHP code. So if you wanted to be able to get a product from the database, normally what you'd do is you would use Magento's built-in get product system. You'd get the product object and then you'd start fetching data from that project. So what the API allows you to do is from anywhere in the world, as long as you have authentication, you can do an HTTP request off of that API and then get that data back from the database. The positive side of this is that means that Magento can be run completely headless. The front end could be anything. It could be a WordPress application. It could be a custom application. As long as you have that API, you can hit off that API, get the data you want back, and interact with the Magento application without having any front end at all. The problem with that is REST APIs, when they call against the Magento backend, if you're requesting a product, it's going to pull back the entire product object. That product object is a weighty amount of information. What GraphQL does is instead of saying, give me everything on the product, you can specify exactly what you want to have returned. And so if you are doing an application refresh and all you need to do is get the name, the product, and the image, and you need no other data, instead of getting the entire object from the REST request, you're just literally getting those pieces of data, which reduces the payload. And with a smaller payload, it creates a snappier response. That snappier response means your application runs faster. So GraphQL is going to change the way in which Magento is able to present content to the users. The REST API is not going anywhere. It's still going to be utilized for a lot of the CRUD application performance that you need to do. But when it comes to just presentation content, you can use GraphQL to query just the information you want so it's lightning fast. So then the question comes, why does all this matter? So for the Magento developers, it matters because the Magento tech stack historically has been very static. Once they've made an opinion about a particular technology, it's in there forever. So for Magento 1, we were still writing prototype, long after prototype was an anachronism and jQuery ruled the world. When we all started picking up on Magento 2, now we're all learning Knockout.js. Well, there isn't a whole lot of people learning Knockout.js. And it's not that Knockout.js is a bad system, but that system in and of itself just isn't the modern tech stack. So having a system where front-end developers can come in and use the tools that they're learning today to be able to build interfaces today frees us up to no longer have to require developers to learn to become Magento developers based off of a chosen tech stack. If you're a Vue developer and you want to develop a front end using Vue, you can do it. If you're an Angular developer and you want to develop an Angular application, you can do it. So no longer are you stuck in a situation as a developer to say, okay, well, I've been doing Angular apps for 3 years now, but I'm doing a Magento job, so now I need to learn Knockout.js and their UI component system and a whole bunch of PHP to be able to do that, and then there's a whole lot of XML configurations. With PWA Studio, that's all going to be gone. And you're going to be able to jump in and be able to do your interface, hand it to the team that's developing the rest of the site, and then go about your day. For the Magento API, we've already kind of covered the improvements that GraphQL is going to have, but what it does is it expands out that functionality. So instead of saying that you have to use REST APIs even when that's not performing, you have an additional option of using GraphQL to have a more performant system. So that guys building out like ERP integration can still use REST, but you as a front-end developer can use GraphQL to be able to hit off that API and then have an application that doesn't lag. For agencies, it's a really interesting turn of events because you no longer have to hire Magento developers. If a person is an excellent front-end developer but they have no Magento experience, that doesn't mean that they have to be spun up to become Magento developers. If you're a front-end developer for Magento 2, you're a full-stack developer because there's no way to not interact with the back end to be able to get the content that you want. So what this does is that frees you up. So if you have somebody who's an exceptional React developer, they can just develop in React. You no longer have to train them up and bring them up to speed with Magento 2 just to be able to get a front end or a theme built. So that differentiation means that people who are really good at what they're doing can stay good at what they're doing, and you don't have to transition them away, which developers are resistant to, but also it's very expensive for agencies to do. And for users, this means that the applications that you are running in Magento will be lightning fast. They will be performant, and people will have the expectation that when they're shopping online, they're going to be able to utilize that the same way any other application is. By increasing the speed and the performance of that system, you give users a user experience that they're already going to expect, which means you can retain customers, you can increase conversions because the expectation of an app-like experience already exists, and it's being presented with no additional cost to you as the developer. So right now the PWA Studio is in its infancy. It's working on GitHub right now, and they're literally breaking changes that occur on a daily basis. So when you pull that repo will depend on how successful you are with being able to do that. And that's kind of exciting for us because it means that we get to be watching this system develop in real time. We can learn it as they're developing it, and we can spin it up quickly. But that doesn't mean that it's the only project out there. So the number one project that I've been experiencing is the Vue.js storefront. I'll post a link below for how to get in there and start using it. And I'm going to do a little example of how to get in there and what it looks like. But with Vue.js, This is a project that's coming that is completely independent of Magento. And so this project is production ready. It already is in a 1.0 state. So you can pull this down from GitHub, start building out an application, integrate it with your Magento shop, and you can start using this today. It is lightning fast, as I'll show. But it's also one of those projects that has a lot of excitement and energy behind it. The one liability here is every developer gets bored with what they're doing. And while there's a lot of excitement and energy behind this project right now, eventually you're going to get to a point where the developers are going to want to move on to something else. So for a store, when they invest in building out their e-commerce shop, the choices they have to make along a 5 to 10 year trajectory. So if you were to build out a site with Vue Storefront, it's fully supported now, but in 5 years, is it still going to be supported? There is an issue with this concept of being able to run a headless Magento site where people can build applications that run great and are really well built and really thoughtful today, but in 4 or 5 years may be abandoned. And if they're abandoned, it means that store now, when they need service or support for that particular system, can go to an agency and ask for support, and that agency can say, well, we don't even know what you're doing here. The one benefit of building your application off of Magento's official system is that we know that Magento is going to support this system forever. As long as 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4 is around, they're going to be supporting the PWA Studio project, which means you're able to build off of that system and that you know that somebody is at least going to be looking at that, and they're going to be making sure that it integrates and fully works with your Magento store. If you build off of another project, something like Vue Storefront, which is great, it's a fantastic project, you run the liability of a Magento update breaking your storefront. So because you may have a change within the core that now makes the connector between this storefront and your backend possible, if that connector changes or is deprecated or doesn't work or has a bug, it's up to you as the merchant to be able to find a developer who can dig into the system and actually figure out what's going on with it. So while I think these projects are great and I think they're wonderful, we have to take them with a grain of salt and understand that there are some times when they just don't work for a long-term store build. So this is me. I'm Mike. This is me in a hat. Storefront project that's running off of Magento 2. When you start navigating around, you can tell that it looks like an application, it feels like an application. You can be able to filter content lightning fast and be able to get query results based off of that. So let's say you want to just have black bags that are greater than $50. These kind of navigation results are near instantaneous when it comes to the web world. By clicking onto those, even though you have load times, you can sense that you're on a website that's loading content. That lag and that delay and that pause that exists on normal applications just isn't here. You add something to the cart, it instantly pops up. You hit OK, and then you look at your content, going to checkout, and the checkout page itself loads before the animation actually happens. This kind of performance is only possible when you're utilizing these kind of techniques. When you use PWA to be able to mitigate the amount of data load that happens on the front end, you can get this kind of performance. Now, this is a simple store. This has a couple of hundred products. This isn't testing the limits of Magento itself, but what it does is it shows a framework that you can begin to start developing your store in a way that's going to be performant towards a user experience, not towards a particular tech stack or a design pattern that was handed down from application architects. So here's a live example of a site that's built off the PWA Studio. Unfortunately, I can't navigate around it because, okay, there we go. So this is a live site that's currently on, you can purchase from today. And you can get a sense that even though this is Magento 2, it doesn't feel like a Magento 2 shop. It's fast, it's responsive. The kind of interactivity seems playful at times. It doesn't seem static or slow. And as you're navigating around, you can start drilling down into content that isn't necessarily it has a thoughtfulness to the way in which you can navigate around and see different content and be able to find the thing that you're looking for and then add it to your cart and purchase it. And of course they have a cat theme because cats rule the internet. Now, as far as like the updates go and the quality of the build, I mean, this is brand new technology, but you can see that it's just as quick as the demo store. So this is a live site. This is a jewelry store that's selling stuff today.
And you're translating this in line with Google.
Yes.
Translate, right?
So Google is doing all the translate for me. I don't read Russian in any kind of sophisticated sense. But even the filtering system, I mean, this is a relatively small catalog, but even if you're trying to whittle down, what do we say, a couple of dozen products, it does it quick. It does it fast. And there's still lazy loading. There's still some little quirks about it, but it doesn't lag in the same way that Magento.
I think you're right. It is more playful.
Agreed.
Where, it's not as irritating.
And you're not standing there waiting.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely feels much more like an app in that your user experience is much more focused, right? It's about the things you need at that very moment, being easily accessible, loading quickly, and functioning in an intuitive manner. I think that definitely has the feel of a native app much more.
Mm-hmm.
And if this is a Russian site, it's probably being hosted in Eastern Europe. So we're also dealing with a site that's overseas with speed of light crossing the Atlantic issues too.
Yeah.
And it's still lightning fast.
Still lightning fast, yeah.
Yep.
It's impressive.
It is super cool. So here's an example of the Magento 2.2 running the default Luma theme. And when you're navigating around the site, you definitely get the sense that there is a little bit less of a flow to it. Pages load fine. I mean, it's a relatively performant system, and you can interact with it, take a look at the different elements. And it's certainly not a slow site, but even adding to the cart, you can tell that there's a particular lag to this. It relies heavily on caching to be able to get its performance, and then when you're navigating to the different components where caching is not either enabled or is not possible, you end up with these long load times with a spinner that gives you feedback that something's happening. You don't get the sense that the application is broken, but here we are, we're running to the checkout page. We haven't hit this with the cache yet, so maybe it's not exactly the performance you would expect, but it is performance that you sometimes see on a slower site with a bad request. And as the page is painting, you get a sense that something is happening in the background, but it is slow, and there's no way to mitigate that perception from a customer's perspective. Even to pages that we haven't visited yet, we have things like this, where the cache is trying to catch up, and it's just not there. It just hasn't gone and cached correctly. So even going back to the checkout, now that the checkout is cached, you still have a substantial delay. It's going to be faster, it's going to be quicker, but it's still slow by modern standards.